All right. So tonight I want to start off by, first of all, we did this last week and this worked out well too. Is there any questions or follow-up from this morning's lesson that you were confused about or that you want further explanation about or anything like that? We'll open it up to that if you've got something. If you don't, that's fine too. All right. So, there was a very popular TV show that came out not too long ago about a guy that's referred to as the Mandalorian. And there is a phrase that he says throughout the entire TV show about the creed, the way of life, if you will, that the Mandalorians follow after. And I'm not going to get into a long discussion of all of the history of all those things and tying it with all the Star Wars movies or anything like that. I'm not that guy to have that conversation. I'm sure there's that guy somewhere here that you can talk to. But one thing that is said throughout the movie or throughout the TV series is, this is the way. This is the way. And it's an interesting concept. Now, obviously, whenever I see anything in pop culture, I try to sermonize it. I think about illustrations. I think about how it may to apply to us as we're studying different things. And so this evening, we're going to talk about the way. And notice especially the way in the Gospel of Mark here in a little bit. But before we do that, what was the name, if you had to answer this question, what was the name of the early Christian movement in the first century? What did they call themselves? The Way. Isn't that interesting? You know, we call ourselves Christians. We call ourselves the Church of Christ. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that whatsoever. Obviously, it's a biblical name. Romans in chapter 16, that the churches of Christ salute you. It's a group of people, a community that belongs to the Christ. But if you had to talk to first century people, they would probably refer to themselves as the Way. In fact, here is a list in Acts chapter, starting in Acts chapter 9 and verse 2 and several other places where this term, the Way, is used to refer to Christians. Okay? So if you remember over in Acts chapter 9 and in verse 2, there was a certain individual that was persecuting the Way. What was his name? His name was Saul. He thought that he needed to do these things against those who were of the Way. Why were they called the Way? Okay, because they were a different way. I'm sorry, what? All right, they followed the way. I heard something else. All right, John 14, verse 6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. If we are thinking about when the Gospel of John is written, Gospel of John is written much later, we think, than the other Gospels, and so there is already this doctrine of teaching that is following along. So when John writes that about Jesus saying that in John 14, that has a much deeper meaning by that time than it did originally. The way. What's anything else? All those comments are completely correct. But any other comments about why they were called the Way, you think? I'm sorry, say it again, Claire. Okay, maybe because Jesus kept saying, follow me. And if you're going to follow me, then you're going to have to go a certain way, right? And so they are of that way. All right, now I want you to notice something else that's very interesting. We're going to go to the Gospel of Mark, okay? And I want you to look at these following passages with me, okay? We're going to take the time to read each and every one. It's not going to be on the screen, so you're going to have to do it the old-fashioned way, either in your Bible or the not-so-old-fashioned way on your phone. And you can look these passages up with me, okay? So we'll start in Mark in chapter 1 and in verse 2. Mark chapter 1 in verse 2. As it is written in the prophets, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, Prepare the way of the Lord. Make his paths straight. Turn over to chapter 8 now. Chapter 8, this is where we've been camping out the past couple weeks in our Sunday morning lessons. Chapter 8 and verse 27. Now Jesus and his disciples went out to the towns of Caesarea Philippi, and on the road he asked his disciples, saying to them, "Who do men say that I am?" Chapter 9, verses 33 and 34. Then he came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What was it you disputed among yourselves on the road?" But they kept silent, for on the road they had disputed among themselves who would be the greatest. Chapter 10, and in verse 17. Chapter 10, verse 17. Now as he was going out on the road, one came running, knelt before him, and asked him, "Good teacher, what shall I do that I may inherit eternal life?" Verse 32 of chapter 10. Now, when they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was going before them, and they were amazed, and as they followed, they were afraid. Then he took the 12 aside again and began to tell them the things that would happen to him. Verse 46. This is where we were a couple weeks ago, talking about the second blind man. Verse 46. Now they came to Jericho, and as he went out of Jericho with his disciples, a great multitude, blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, sat by the road begging. Verse 52. Then Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus on the road. All right. What do you find in common with all of these verses? All right, the road, the way. It's the same Greek word, by the way. Okay, by the way. It's the same word, road, way, path. In fact, this word is also used in Mark chapter 4 when we're talking about the parable of the sower. I think it's a different context, and so it doesn't fit what I'm going with tonight. But when you read the wayside, that's the same word there too. All right? I think that's interesting. What are some things that jump out at you? Okay, first of all, let's think about this. Is this coincidence as Mark is writing, or is there something more here? The correct answer would be more, usually in a Bible class, right? But what is that more? What do you think he's trying to get across to us that he is? It could have been just coincidence that as he is writing this gospel, it just happened to be that they were on a road, they were on a way, and so he's just making remarks about it. But let's remember, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago, I believe, let's remember that Mark is not just writing a biography, okay? He is not writing a historical book in that he's just reporting different historical events. They are historical events, but he is, at the same time that he is reporting about Jesus, he is writing theology, okay? He is telling you a story on purpose so you can get to know Jesus and therefore would want to follow Jesus. Okay? It is evangelistic in some ways. It is apologetic in some ways. There is more to it. It's not like just opening up your history book and reading something, but instead he is preaching a gospel, a good news when he is doing this. So the different things that we see, the choices that are made when he writes certain things, perhaps have a point that you need to see. And it's interesting, in all of these verses right here, one thing that is in common with all of them is they have the way there. They have the word way, which is sometimes translated road. What do you think could be the point that Mark is trying to get across, especially in that section from chapter 8 through chapter 10? Yes, Tarsha, I knew you would have something to say. Okay. So Mark is trying to point out that Jesus is wanting them being the disciples, them being us, to follow him. And when you follow him, there is a certain way that you have to go. I think that's good. Yes, Miss Claire.
Maybe he was trying to bring their attention back to the Old Testament and connecting the fact that this way we were talking about is this Jesus.
Okay, definitely so. When you have, especially those first two verses from Mark chapter 1 and in chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, where it ties in the Old Testament, it ties in the prophets. And so even the Old Testament speaks of the way, and this person, this Jesus. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to say that maybe it's talking about how Jesus actually went out, and like earlier we were talking about prepare the way.
Mm-hmm.
He actually walked away. He went out to all these different places seeking people.
Definitely so. So we have in these different contexts here, Jesus is actually on the road. He's doing the thing, right? He is, not only is he the way, but he is on the way, and he is asking people to come this way. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so he also told his disciples, he said, go make disciples again.
Mm-hmm.
The disciples followed his way.
Right.
That was another.
Definitely so. So when we jump to a different context of Matthew chapter 28, and they said, go into all the world and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them all things I've commanded you, right? There in that making disciples, if the disciples are people that follow Jesus, then the disciples are supposed to make disciples that also follow Jesus. And the one thing that's going to be consistent through all of these disciples is which way are they going to go? The way, right? How many ways are there? There's one way, right? It's like driving in downtown Orlando sometimes. You turn, this is the wrong way. This is the one way. I need to go the one way, okay? Now, I just want to, here's some different observations that I have made. You've made some observations. Here's some things that I want you to think about. We can have some discussion about this and how you feel about these different things too. The first one is, the way leads to the cross. Okay, I want you to notice what happens there in Mark and in chapter 10 and verse 32. All right, so far, starting in Mark 8 and verse 27, until we get to this point, Mark has tried to, I believe, purposefully set the scenario, set the setting, if you will, that they have been on the road. Okay? They have been on this road, they have been traveling. But where are they traveling to? We don't really know yet. But we find out right here that while they've been traveling on the road, notice what happens. Now they were on the road going up to where? Jerusalem. Now, they're not going to Jerusalem like in the Gospel of John, that Jesus goes to Jerusalem several different times. In fact, 3 different times for 3 different feasts or for 3 different Passovers. And that's why, by the way, we think that Jesus' ministry was 3 years long. It's because the Gospel of John has 3 Passovers. And there's only 1 Passover per year. And so if he's at 3 Passovers, then his ministry is 3 years long, okay? But he is going to Jerusalem here, and it says, and Jesus was going before them, and they were amazed, and as they followed, they were afraid. Then he took the 12 disciples aside and began to tell them the things that would happen to him. Now, this is the third prediction of his death. Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem. And the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and scourge him and spit on him and kill him, and the 3rd day he will rise again. So what we see from a literary standpoint is that the entire time that Jesus is walking down the road, where is he headed? He's going to Jerusalem to the cross. That is always where he was headed. And he has these other guys that are with him too. And if Jesus is going to the cross, then where should we expect to find his disciples? At the cross. Because guess where the way always ends? At the cross. So that's the first observation that I think is interesting. Second observation is that the way was always the plan. Right? Sometimes, especially in a premillennialist type thought, there is the idea that Jesus came to earth to set up his kingdom. The Jews rejected him, and so Jesus had to go, what am I going to do now? Oh, I'll set up the church instead, and then I'll come back and set up my earthly kingdom. No, the way was always the plan. In fact, you can, as Claire pointed out, from the Old Testament, the prophets pointed to that Jesus was the way. Prepare the way of the Lord. And the way of the Lord was always a part of the plan, always leading to the cross. Questions, comments, things you want to add to these first two observations? Yes?
So, was it that the way was always there, but then how that happened? Like the steps that it took to get to the cross?
I would say I'm not understanding your question.
So, for example,
Okay.
like Jesus' betrayal wasn't part of maybe the original plan, but him getting to the cross was what was happening.
I would say that the betrayal, I would say that everything was a part of the original plan. What I was saying, and I need to make sure I differentiate this better. What I was saying is that there is a premillennialist thought, which is an incorrect thought, that the plan was for Jesus to reign, and then the Jews rejected him, and so they had to have plan B, the second plan, if you will. But the plan all along was for Christ to die on the cross. And that is how that you have all these Old Testament prophecies that the New Testament writers are now pulling from and saying, this is that. What that was back there, this is now it. This is Jesus. And that's how Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 talks about how that not a jot or a tittle will pass away until I fulfill all these things. Anything you read about in the Old Testament, in one sense or another, is fulfilled through Jesus. He is the fulfillment of all of those things. And this was always the way. This is the way, right? It was always the way. All right, observation number 3. Jesus doesn't point to the way, but walks it. I love this idea. It makes me think about The Wizard of Oz, right? Remember the first character that Dorothy ends up running into is who? Scarecrow. And Scarecrow is going to point the way for her to go. Of course, hilarity ensues, right? Because the Scarecrow keeps pointing different directions. Eventually, the Scarecrow joins Dorothy on the walk, on the way to where they are going also. But it's interesting that Jesus doesn't say, hey, over here, that's the way. Go that way. But what does he do? He walks it. The entire time, every single time that you look at Jesus on the road in this section from Mark chapter 8 through Mark chapter 10, it's not that he is pointing them on the direction to go. He is leading them on the direction to go. He is on the way also. He walks it with his disciples. Now, apply that to you. How does that work? You be the preacher. What's the points that you get out of that? That Jesus led by example. Because of that what?
Because of that, we are without excuse.
All right, we are without excuse. We know the way to go because of Jesus and him showing us the way to go. Yes, ma'am.
And in order to be with him, we've got to go that way.
if you're going to be with Jesus, you got to go the same way that he goes, right? There is this tomfoolery, if you will, of thought that people say there is all kinds of different ways that lead to heaven. No, there is the way, and that is Jesus. There's one way. It's not like you can take all these different routes and all these different things and get to the same location as far as we're concerned in the Bible. Jesus is the way, and he walks that way. What other things could you pull out? And think application. How can you apply this? Yes?
The way be classified as the word?
Okay, would the way be classified as the word? Yes, the word shows the way. And I think so a lot of times when we're in New Testament theology, there's the mixing of metaphors sometimes that, the word is Jesus, the way is from the word, and Jesus is the way, and he is the word. He's all of those things, and it all works together. He is the lamb of the sacrifice, but he also is the Passover lamb, and he also is the this and that. And so definitely that ties in. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for all of you pointing the way. Definitely so. To apply James chapter 1 and in verse 21, be doers of the word, not hearers only. But think about it like this too. When you are trying to teach somebody the gospel, don't point them, walk with them. Go with them. Show them how it works. Walk with them along the way. Right? That there is so much more opportunity to teach and to guide somebody when you are walking along with them. And Jesus does that also. He doesn't just have with an edict say, go that way. He says, y'all come with me. And in fact, John in his gospel, right, in John chapter 1, and it's mentioned other places too, come and see. You come with me, and you see it for yourself. Okay, we got some more hands. Yay. Yes, ma'am.
So every day, my thoughts, my actions should reflect Jesus. People should be able to see him living in me and actually walking in that same way.
Definitely so. Every day, my thoughts and actions should be following after Jesus, and that is something that can be seen by others, right? That you are the way. All you as Christians, just like in the first century, you are the way now. Not because you are awesome, but because he is awesome, and you're following him. Yes, Tarsha?
I was just going to say, from what Liz was saying, it's not, or what you said about teaching others, it's not about just those outside of the body, but also those within as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Example in walking in the way, staying in the way, so that if someone kind of veers off, you can kind of still show the path.
Definitely so. And that's what church is about. I know a lot of times we have the concept and we just struggle with this concept, right? That church is a place you go. It's a building we meet in. And I oftentimes say to the kids, hey, I'm going to the church. And they know what I mean. I mean the office. I mean here. But we are a community, the way that is all walking the same direction. And when someone stops walking that direction, then those who are on the way go over and they say, hey, it's this way. And we walk together. So whether it be leading someone to Christ or continuing to lead somebody as we go along. Yes, Neil.
From a practical standpoint, too, that every time they were on the way, it was the one time Jesus had the 12 disciples with him.
Yes.
Without distraction, without other people around, and he could tell them what he wanted to tell them.
Definitely so. So Mark on purpose, as he is writing this gospel, as I mentioned also this morning, he slows down. Okay? He slows down. He's no longer has Jesus running here and there and doing all of these things and all the oohs and the ahs and all that stuff. But instead, he has his disciples with him walking on the road, on the way, headed towards the cross. And where it's also interesting, I don't know if you called it or not, I think it was in chapter 9 perhaps. It's also in chapter 8. When he is telling them about the cross, it says in the text there that he told them plainly. He's not speaking in parables anymore, folks. When it comes to the cross, he's saying, hey, this is exactly what's going to happen. Now, they still didn't get it. They were dense and confused and all of those things. But he spoke to them plainly instead of speaking to them in a parable. There's another hand. Or yes, Eric. Right. Definitely. Yeah, perhaps a better way to put that is he doesn't just point to the way, right? He actually embodies the way. And I think it's so very important for us as Christians. We can get very easily just caught up in telling other people what they're supposed to do, right? And looking out in the world and go, well, that's wrong, and that's wrong, and that's wrong. But let us be people that actually live it, right? Walk the walk, if you will. Walk the way. And don't just say, hey, y'all go do this, but I'm not going to do it. Jesus never did that. He did the thing, and they got other people to follow him, too. All right. On the way, we can lose perspective. All right? I want you to notice a couple of the passages that we looked at. Look in chapter 9 again. And in verse 33. And when he came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, what was it you disputed among yourselves on the road, on the way? But they kept silent, for on the road or on the way, they had disputed among themselves who would be the greatest. Here these disciples are on their way with Jesus as Jesus is headed where? To the cross. And what are they most concerned about? Being number one. Who's going to be the top dog? Me, right? They're most concerned about me. Now, apply that to us. How does that work? You're on the way, you're on the road. You are following after Jesus. But what can happen to you also? You can have distractions. Because, on the road, there's billboards there for a reason, right? Because you'll see it. You'll be distracted by it. What else? How does this work for us? Remember, let's think about the context of why these things were written. It was written to a first century group of people who some were in the church, some were not in the church. And then also now it is written to us as we are studying it in the church, if you will. How does this idea that they were on the road and while they were on the road, they were disputing among themselves who would be the greatest? How does that apply to you and I? Yes.
I look at it, and these were men who were with Jesus. They walked with Jesus. And if they can become distracted or lose their focus on what is real important, surely we're going to have those moments, and how important it is for us to make sure that we are staying in the Word. Because even staying in the Word, you might have to approach me one day and say, hey,
right.
Rhonda, you know?
There's definitely the possibility, even as these people, and these were disciples who were actually with the flesh and blood Christ, if they had the opportunity to lose perspective in their present context, then surely us, removed by time and space and all of those things, perhaps we can lose perspective when we're on the road. And I think another thing it points out to me, okay, this may not be for you, but it is for me, is that sometimes when I'm walking down the road with Christ, I become more worried about myself than I do about my Christ. I can be one that wants to be great while I'm walking down the road. Maybe I'll even talk to other people walking down the road and go, hey, look, I'm walking so good. Don't y'all wish y'all could walk as good as me? And all of these things. And then Christ is walking up ahead of me and just shaking his head. He's like, man, you don't get it, do you? That's what he says to, he doesn't actually say that to the disciples, but that's why I read in between the lines many times when he's talking to them. He goes, y'all just don't get it. And sometimes that is us too. We as the church sometimes want to be great among ourselves instead of elevating Christ. Remember, everything that we do, we should be bringing glory to Christ, bringing glory to Him. Even the good things you do, that's what Jesus says over in Matthew in chapter 5. Those good things that you do, those good deeds that other people see, that light that you shine is not so people will look and go, wow, that's a really bright light. It's so they can go, wow, He has an amazing God. I want to follow with Him. Remember, even Paul. We can say Paul was great and he did many wonderful things, but it's interesting that when Paul would talk about himself, he referred to himself as what? The chief of all sinners. Faithful and true saying that it is worthy of all acceptance, that Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. And you may think, like, I can think of a lot of other sinners out there who are worse than you, Paul. I mean, Paul, I know you had a rough start and all of those things, but look at all the good that you've done. Look at all the churches that you helped plant. Look at all the writings that you have written. Look at all the sermons you have preached. Look at all the people who will have a share in the glories of heaven because what you have done. How dare you say that you're the chief of all sinners? But what he is doing, he's not comparing himself to all of you. He's comparing himself to Christ. And when he thinks about Christ and then thinks about himself, he is the chief of all sinners. And I think it's important while we're along the road for us not to lose the perspective about where we are headed. We are following Christ, and that road leads to the cross. Let's look at the last one. When you follow Jesus, you follow the way. I think almost Mark, he doesn't use it interchangeably, but it's interesting that Jesus is always on the road. In this section here, okay, he's always on the road, and people are following him. Now notice what happens in chapter 10, again in verse 32. Now, when they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was going ahead of them, before them. Same verse a little bit later on. And as they followed. When you are following Jesus, you are following the way. All right, notice this over in chapter 10 and in verse 46. So we already pointed out, we did this last week just to refresh ourselves. Chapter 10 and verse 46 tells the story about the second blind man. Okay, we had the first blind man in chapter 8, and that blind man took two different healings. Not that Jesus couldn't heal him the first time, but he was healed in two stages. The first stage, he was able to see a little bit, but then it was still blurry. And then the second stage, he was able to see things clearly. Here we have the second blind man, and what is interesting is that all of the predictions fall in between these two blind stories. Okay? And again, I think this is Mark, in a way, trying to tell his story to you by saying, if you want to be able to see, then you have to see it this way. And it goes to the cross. But we have there in verse 46, now they came to Jericho, and as they went out of Jericho with his disciples and a great multitude, blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, sat by he was by the road. He was along the way. And when you're going along the way, following Jesus, there may be somebody that's beside the way. What should you do? Bring them along. You remember the song you sang in Sunday school many, many years ago about roll the gospel chariot along? And if you see a sinner, then what are you going to do? you got to stop and pick them up. And you keep rolling along with that gospel chariot. Okay? But notice what happens. So after we have, so verse 49, so Jesus stood still and commanded him to be called. And then they called the blind man, saying to him, be of good cheer, he is calling you. So what we have here is we have another calling story, another disciple calling story, very similar to what we find in Mark chapter 1 when he called the original disciples who became the 12. And throwing aside his garment, he rose and came to Jesus. In the first disciple calling story, they threw aside their nets, right, to follow after him. Now, this is a blind man who's been a poor beggar. He doesn't have much stuff. But what he does have, he sacrifices and surrenders. He throws it to the side to come to Jesus. So Jesus answered and said to him, what do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said, Rabboni, or that means teacher, that I may receive my sight. Then Jesus said to him, go your way. Okay, watch this now. Go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus on the way. When Jesus interacts with you in your life, and once you see him for who he is, like blind Bartimaeus saw him, which way should you go? The way of the Lord. It's interesting there in the text, he says, go your way. What ends up being the blind man's way? The Lord's way. Apply it to yourself. I mean, there it is, right? We talk about, especially in this world today of postmodernism and stuff, that you can have your own truth, you can go your own way, you can do your own thing. People need to leave you alone, just let you do your thing. And if you want to do something that's completely crazy, then people should celebrate you for doing that thing, right? That is foreign to the gospel. There is one way, and your way should be the Lord's way. And if your way is not the Lord's way, then open your eyes. Cry out to him, Lord, I want to see. And then once you see, follow the way. Questions, comments, other thoughts?
This is the third time we see that he tries to tell them about his resurrection, his death, and the way. And it's interesting that all three times, it kind of says that they're afraid, they're scared, which just goes to show that the way is not going to be easy.
Definitely.
But then what's neat to me is that each time he says he gives them a way out. He says that though he's going to die, he's going to be raised.
Yes.
Always gives them some hope at the end of the long way that they're expected to follow.
Right. There's a balance there. Hey, I'm going to die, but each time also in the third day I will rise. But something that we need to be reminded is you never get to the resurrection until you get to Calvary first. And the same thing is true for us. We cannot have a resurrected life until we have a sacrificed, crucified life on the cross. But it definitely is that beautiful balance there. And it's interesting what the disciples hear and don't hear, what they understand and don't understand, what they see and don't see. Yes, Tim.
All this talk of walking in the way and the road, I think of 1 John 1 and 7. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his son, cleanses us from all sin. So if you have any doubt as to what is at the end of the road, it's this walk that cleanses us.
Definitely so. The sacrifice on the cross, it provides a eternal cleansing for us. It was Mike Tenero, which was a preacher in Western Kentucky when my wife was growing up. He had a sermon that talks about that verse. As you walk, he wipes. You walk, he wipes. You keep walking that path, and he wipes away those sins. Good stuff to think about. This is one of those things that if you read the Gospel of Mark, you may miss that, right? And it's because we translate the word differently. If we translated the word the same way the whole time, perhaps it would jump out at you, but also wouldn't make as much sense as far as our English mind is concerned. All right, we're getting ready to enter into a time of worship, but real quick, there is a short little video that I want to show you about the Widowhood Workshop. And so as a way of advertisement for it, that's going to be this weekend coming up.
I've been watching football since the days of Jim Brown and Paul Warfield and Joe Namath and Ernie Ladd and Dick Butkus. You know what that proves? It proves two things. Number one, I love football. But number two, I'm old. One of the most colorful and quoted coaches in the NFL history is a fellow by the name of Bum Phillips. He was the coach for the Houston Oilers and then a little bit later after that with the New Orleans Saints. He had a unique vocabulary as well as a unique accent. Here's an observation he made. He said, you know, there's two kinds of coaches in the NFL. Them that's been fired and them that's going to be fired. You know, there's a similarity between that and the reality of living in this world and experiencing loss. There's two kinds of people in this world. Those that have experienced loss and those that are going to experience loss. The bottom line is, loss is inevitable. There's a book called A Grace Disguised, and in the preface of the first edition, here's what the writer says. Sooner or later, all people suffer loss, in little doses or big ones, suddenly or over time, privately or in public settings. Loss is as much a part of normal life as birth. For as surely as we're born into this world, we will suffer loss before we leave it. It is not, therefore, the experience of loss that becomes the defining moment of our lives. It is how we respond to the loss that matters. If we're going to experience losses, don't you think it would be a good thing for us to prepare for them? When is the best time to prepare for a storm? Don't you think it's before we experience it? The same thing is true with losses. I'm not suggesting that any preparation could be absolutely perfect and totally prepare anybody for a severe loss in their life. But some preparation is surely going to help us to navigate the rough waters of the storm that we experience when we suffer loss. One of the purposes of the Widowhood Workshop Ministry is to help people think about, talk about, study about the issue of loss. And hopefully in doing that, we can help people to deal with the losses they experience in their life. If you'd like to learn more about the Widowhood Workshop Ministry, I invite you to go to the website, widowhoodworkshop.com.
So this weekend, that's what we are going to have here. And there has been flyers out about it, flock notes and other things like that. So if you are able to join us for that, it is a wonderful event, and we're thankful that we have this opportunity. So make sure you take part in that. It's Saturday and Sunday here at the building. We're now going to enter into a time of worship. We'll have some songs. Let's all stand together as we have our first song.